Two railway workers clocked in for a night shift on August 8, 1963, and neither of them ever really came back. One would spend the rest of his life unable to work the job he loved. The other would be gone before he turned 35. The locomotive they were riding that night would become so toxic to the railway industry that it was scrapped within weeks of withdrawal, just to make sure nobody could ever look at it again. It is 3 a.m. and a Class 40 diesel is hauling 12 carriages through the English countryside when the driver sees a red signal up ahead where there should not be one. The locomotive is D326, a 2,000 horsepower Whistler that has been running the West Coast Main Line for about 3 years. And the man behind the controls is Jack Mills, a 58-year-old driver from Crewe who has been working on the railway since 1919. He does exactly what any driver would do when faced with that signal. He brings the train to a stop and waits for his second man to figure out what is going on. That second man is David Whitby, 26 years old, and when he climbs down from the cab to use the lineside telephone, he discovers that the wires have been cut clean through. Before he can turn around to warn Mills that something is very wrong, men in balaclavas grab him from behind and throw him down the embankment into the darkness below. What happens next would become the most infamous crime in British railway history, and it would turn D326 into something the railway industry wanted to pretend had never existed. The train Jack Mills was driving that night was the Up Special, a Royal Mail service running from Glasgow Central to London Euston, carrying registered mail and high-value packages in a specially designated carriage positioned right behind the locomotive. There had been a bank holiday weekend in Scotland, and the banks had been processing enormous amounts of currency, which meant the total value sitting in those mail sacks was somewhere around £2.5 million. In today's money, that would be well over £60 million, and a gang of 15 men had spent months planning exactly how to get their hands on it. They had tampered with the signal at Sears Crossing by covering the green light with a glove and wiring a battery to the red. So as far as Jack Mills could tell, he was following proper procedure when he brought D326 to a halt. The gang swarmed the locomotive from both sides the moment Whitby was out of the way. Mills suddenly found himself fighting for his life in the cab of his own engine. He managed to grapple with one attacker, but another came up behind him and struck him over the head with an iron bar. The blow opened 5 wounds across his skull and left him barely conscious, bleeding onto the floor of the cab, while the robbers tried to figure out their next problem. They had brought their own train driver with them, a retired man named Stan Agate. But when Agate climbed into the cab of D326, he realized immediately that he had absolutely no idea how to operate it. He had spent his entire career working on Southern Region shunters, small locomotives used for moving wagons around in yards, and a mainline Class 40 was a completely different machine with unfamiliar controls and a braking system he had never seen before. Their solution was to force Jack Mills, with blood running down his face and his vision swimming from the blow, to drive D326 forward to Bridego Bridge, where the rest of the gang was waiting with a truck to haul away the loot. Mills had no choice in the matter. He drove the locomotive and the first 2 carriages about half a mile down the track, while the robbers formed a human chain and unloaded 120 mail sacks in less than 30 minutes. By the time anyone raised the alarm, they had vanished into the night with £2.5 million, leaving Mills and Whitby handcuffed inside one of the carriages, with instructions not to move for half an hour. The Great Train Robbery became an instant sensation in the British press, and the robbers themselves became something like folk heroes in the public imagination. Ronnie Biggs escaped prison and fled to Brazil, where he lived as a celebrity for decades, while the authorities could do nothing to bring him back. Films were made about the heist, books were written, and what people tended to forget, in all the excitement, was that 2 railway workers had their lives destroyed that night, while the men who attacked them got famous for it. Jack Mills never recovered from what happened in that cab. He spent months off work, and when he finally returned, he was put on shunting duties only, moving wagons around in yards rather than driving the mainline services he had handled for over 20 years. The man, who had been a driver since 1942, never took a passenger train out again. He retired in 1967. He died in 1970 from leukemia, aged 64, though his family has always maintained that the injuries he sustained that night contributed to his declining health in the years that followed. David Whitby went back to work as a secondman, but the trauma of being thrown down that embankment and held captive stayed with him. In 1972, he suffered a heart attack at just 34 years old. Meanwhile, D326 kept running. British Rail renumbered it to 40126 in 1974 when they introduced the new top system, and it continued hauling trains across the network as if nothing had ever happened. But stories circulated among the crews, the kind of stories that get passed around in mess rooms and on platforms late at night. Some drivers said they would rather not be rostered for that particular engine if they could help it. Whether any of it was true hardly mattered because the reputation stuck, and among certain crews, that was enough. When British Rail finally withdrew 40126 from service in February 1984, something unusual happened. The locomotive was offered to the National Railway Museum in York as a potential exhibit given its historical significance, but the museum turned it down flat. They did not want a locomotive that was famous for being the scene of a violent crime that left one man permanently injured and contributed to the early passing of 2 railway workers. British Rail agreed, and within 8 weeks of withdrawal, D326 had been reduced to scrap metal at Doncaster Works. The speed of the scrapping was deliberate because the railway wanted to prevent souvenir hunters from picking the locomotive apart piece by piece, the way they had done with other famous engines. The Great Train Robbery carriage had been dealt with years earlier. In 1970, the actual HVP coach was taken to a scrapyard in Norwich and burned in the presence of police specifically to prevent it from becoming a morbid attraction. The locomotive and the carriage were erased as thoroughly as the authorities could manage. Today, there is a street in Crewe called Jack Mills Way and another called David Whitby Way, named in honor of the 2 men who were just doing their jobs on the night in August 1963. A locomotive was named Driver Jack Mills in 2014 so that the name would keep running on the railway network. These are the ways the railway industry chose to remember the human beings who paid the price, while the machine that carried them into that nightmare was cut up and melted down so that no trace would remain. D326 ran for 23 years and hauled thousands of trains across the country before that one night in Buckinghamshire changed everything. The locomotive did nothing wrong, and the men who built it at Vulcan Foundry in 1960 could never have imagined what would happen 3 years later. But history has a way of attaching itself to objects, whether those objects deserve it or not. And D326 became permanently associated with violence and shame that the railway industry simply wanted to forget. The robbers got their films and their celebrity status. Jack Mills and David Whitby got streets named after them decades later. And D326 got 8 weeks between withdrawal and the cutting torch. That is what happens when a machine becomes the wrong kind of famous.